Albert Breer is the Monday morning quarterback joining us on the program. Let me start with Bill Belichick. Bill Belichick coaching his last game as Patriots head coach this weekend.
I think so. Now, you never know what could happen when Kraft gets into a room with Belichick next week. But I don't think this is a decision that you wake up on Monday morning and make. In other words, like in some cases, an owner will decide on the last Sunday of the season, I want to sleep on it, and it's truly a Black Monday decision. Obviously, with something like this, there's a lot more thought that goes into it, and it's a decision that Kraft's going to have made over months, not weeks. And so, like that part of it, I think is going to make it more difficult for Bill to move Kraft off his spot if that's what he intends to do. And at the very least, I think what we've seen over the last 4 weeks, the team is still playing hard for Bill, and that Bill can still coach. But those were never the issues. The issues are systemic here, and I think if Bill were going to stay as the head coach, it would come with a lot of change around him. And, after losing the most games at any point in 30 years of ownership, I'm not sure Kraft would even be willing to do that. We'll see.
And we were wondering, are they going to use that top 5, top 3 draft pick on a quarterback? If they're sitting there at 3 or 2, are they taking a quarterback?
It's hard to say because we don't know who's making the decision right now, right? Like, I think we make the assumption, DP, that there's going to be some changes in personnel. And I think, in all likelihood, Robert Kraft's probably going to want to hire a general manager. Now, whether that's somebody internal, external, but, even if Bill stays, I would think that maybe you'd want to empower somebody in scouting based on where the roster is right now. And we don't know who that person's going to be right now. And we don't know who the head coach is going to be. That said, I think it's very difficult to see a scenario where whether it's Bill Belichick as the head coach or Gerard Mayo as the head coach, Mac Jones is back in 2024, which puts them in play for a quarterback next year. Now, if they were to blow the whole thing up and go outside the organization and bring in somebody new from the Shanahan tree or something like that, then maybe Mac Jones would have a chance. But if it's either Belichick or Mayo, I have a hard time seeing Mac being back here in 2024, and that would put them in the market for a quarterback in the draft. Now, whether or not they're drafting 3rd or 5th or 7th, we don't know. Whether or not they're going to like the guy who's there for them at 3rd or 5th or 7th, we don't know. Whether that's a Penix or a McCarthy or a Nix or whoever it is, we don't know what they're going to think of those people, but they certainly will be in play. I think regardless of who's the coach, whether it's Belichick or Mayo in 2024.
Give me the biggest reason why Jim Harbaugh will go to the NFL. If that's the case, biggest reason will be what?
Unfinished business in the pros, I think would be the number one thing. And I think close behind it would be like all the circumstances with the NCAA, and the fact that thing's not over. I mean, when that notice of allegations was served to him, a lot of people conflated that as like being for everything. It wasn't, it was just for the quote unquote cheeseburger thing, which was really more of like a COVID recruiting violations thing. And so that means the NCAA hasn't even gotten to the notice on the Connor Stallion situation. So I wouldn't blame Jim if he threw his hands up and says, you know what, like I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, and like it's time to move on. And I think part of his thinking here too is, like that the opportunity to go to the NFL hasn't been vast for him over the last 2 years. So he knows these things can be fickle. And as great as his record was in at the NFL level, teams weren't falling over themselves after the 21 season, after the 22 season to go and get him. Otherwise, I think he might be in the pros right now. And so if there is a strong pursuit of him from the Chargers, from the Raiders, then I think that's certainly something that he looks at 60 years old and says, time to go take care of unfinished business in the league.
He's the Monday morning quarterback, Albert Breer. Speaking of the Raiders, Antonio Pierce has done a really good job. Players seem to like him, but does Mark Davis hold off on giving him the official announcement, the title of head coach, until he knows that maybe he doesn't get Jim Harbaugh? Could it hinge on that?
Yeah, well, the number one thing I think we have to remember here is that he can't just give him the head coaching job because of the rules. Like, so they have to go through a process and, satisfy the Rooney Rule and all the rest of that, right? Okay. Like, so they can't, in this day and age, you can't do that. I do think he likes Antonio Pierce. I know like the guys that he counsels with, and there are three players in particular that he's really counseled with a lot. Ahead of the Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler firings, and then, into all of this. And that's Josh Jacobs, Max Crosby, and Devontae Adams. I think all three of those guys are strong proponents of Antonio Pierce. But what I've pretty consistently heard over the last couple of weeks, Dan, is that he's got a big swing in him. And I don't know whether that swing's going to be Jim Harbaugh or Bill Belichick, but I have heard that he's got a big swing in him. And if he fails to connect on that big swing, then maybe he turns back to Antonio Pierce. But his dad had a great relationship with Belichick. I'm sure you know about that. And he's got a relationship with Jim Harbaugh. He tried to hire him in 2015 when Harbaugh went to Michigan. So one way or the other, there's at least a lot of buzz out there that Mark's got a big swing in him, and he's going to take that swing before, deciding whether or not to make Antonio Pierce his next head coach.
I'm sure the commissioner has a list of things that if you do X, then it costs you Y, or your punishment is going to be this. But when it comes to an owner and David Tepper, I don't know is there a negotiation that goes on between the commissioner and the owner? David Tepper. Do you think that this was a negotiation, or just I'm fining you $300,000 and that's it?
Who's boss? I think that'll answer the question.
Well, that's why I'm wondering: is it a negotiation between owner and the commissioner?
I mean, we know who the boss in this scenario is. So I think that there's definitely back and forth. I don't know specifically in this situation, but I do know in situations like this in the past, whether they involve Jerry Jones or Robert Kraft or Daniel Snyder's like the primary one, right? Where they certainly didn't just come down and sanction Daniel Snyder. There was back and forth there. Jim Irsay, another one. I think this would be one of those where there's definitely some back and forth. And I think, to me, the crazy thing about it, Dan, is you couldn't even take him out of the stadium this Sunday, right? You couldn't even do that. You couldn't even give him the suspension to take him out of the stadium this Sunday. And
why couldn't you do that?
Well, I'd assume it's because Tepper leaned on him, right? The optics of Tepper being back in a stadium this weekend. Think about that. I think that's the one piece of this that everybody's missing. Forget about the money. The guy's got money coming out of his ears. So whatever the money is the money. But, I think, one thing that I can remember somebody saying to me a long time ago, when it came to covering the league, is the one thing you don't do is you don't want to embarrass a billionaire, right? And that's the one thing that really gets these guys. And I think in a certain way, if you look at the apology, it wasn't really an apology, right? Has David Tepper really skipped embarrassment here?
Yes, and that's why I said you want to hurt him. Don't let him go to his stadium to watch his team. Right.
And that looks to me like that's the part that looks incredibly weak, right? Because you could fine him $2 million. That's still a rounding error, right? For him. If you want to make him feel it, you make the story David Tepper is not in the stadium today.
Yeah.
And then people are looking down the field and they see an interim coach, and they do the math, and you know what the math will show them, Dan? This is going to be his 99th game as the team owner. 22 of those 92 games have been presided over by an interim coach. Think about that.
Wow.
22 of 99 games.
Okay, how attractive is this job?
Well, it's 1 of 32. So that should answer your question.
Well, David Tepper is 1 of 32, but he's not like the other owners.
He's going to be able to find somebody. But I think for guys with options, look at Arizona last year, right? So Arizona wasn't a very attractive job. You got a quarterback who maybe you're not sure on, who's got a massive contract that you're tied to because of the guarantees in it. The roster isn't in very good shape. The owner's got some checkered history there too. Arizona wasn't a very attractive job. Jonathan Gannon had to take that job, and he's done a great job, right? But he had to take. Why? Well, because he's a defensive coach, and every year maybe half the owners decide ahead of time, I'm not hiring a defensive coach,
sure.
Right? And then the other half are just going to consider it. It's not like those guys have decided they will. So there's going to be somebody to take the job. But if you're Ben Johnson, do you take it? That to me is the question.
Probably so.
you might not if you have options, right? So I think like these things are a function of a guy's options. Like, does a guy have a strong enough resume where he can wait for a year, right? Like Dan Quinn's waited a year twice. Does a guy have a strong enough resume where he can wait for a year and be assured that his stock is still going to be in good shape a year from now? Does a guy have multiple options so he can look at it and say, because I think like if you look at like whatever the list is of the coaching jobs, the Panthers, because of the ownership situation, are at the very bottom of it. This is like what Bill Parcells and Bill Belichick would tell all of their assistants, right? Which is there's one thing that you cannot change no matter what you do, and that's the owner. That's the one thing, like no matter what. Like remember that when you go and interview for this job, Belichick and Parcells would tell their assistants that. Like the one thing you cannot change is the owner. And right now, David Tepper's, and it's not just this like incident in a vacuum. This incident confirmed what everybody thinks about him already. You know, like in a 3-second video, like everything that's been rumored, everything that's been sort of stereotyped, whatever about David Tepper, like he confirmed all of it in a 3-second video. So, I look at this and it's just again, like I think the Carolina job, as far as desirability, will be at the bottom of the list, which means they're probably going to have to hire a guy who doesn't have the leverage to wait for another year and doesn't have multiple options.